is that sense of the Bible is self-authenticating. And we actually, as modern rational people, we have no problem with things being self-authenticating, do we? So if you see 2 + 2 = 4, we'll prove it. You don't need to prove it because it's maths is self-authenticating. The greatest nation in the world apparently is built on a constitution that starts with, we hold these truths, is that the constitution? Whatever it was. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and I can't remember what they say, but so there are things that say they're just because of what they are, they have that ring of truth that you can't deny. And in a sense, that's what's claimed of the scriptures. And we'll see more of that as we think about the inspiration. I've chosen this framework because I think it's actually a helpful framework to think about what God has done to lead us to the place of putting our confidence in the scriptures. And these so-called 4 coordinates of theology, they come from a book by Michael Horton called Pilgrim Theology. And he says there are kind of 4 basic coordinates. You might remember, if you did the Authentic Life, that I use this in that to talk about the 4 big key aspects of the Bible. So there's drama. Drama is God doing something. Just make sure I'm following my notes here. The big story of God at work in the world, the drama of Scripture, the story, unfolding story. Then out of that is the doctrine. Out of what God does in the world, we know who God is because we see him at work, we know about ourselves, and we have truths that we believe given that are in light of his work. So the people of Israel knew that God was a God of justice and of power and of might because they saw his mighty works bringing them out of Egypt. And so they had the doctrine of God that came out of God being at work in the world. In response to that doctrine is that we worship him. We give glory to him for what he's revealed of himself through what he's done, his work and his revelation. And then out of that worship then flows the way we live, our discipleship. So the way that we live in light of the doctrine that's flowed into our worship of him. So if we apply that framework in how we think about the inspiration of the Bible, I'll just quickly mention, if you think about it, they're kind of the 4 main types of literature that we find in the Bible, aren't they? We have the narrative sections that tell us the drama, the story. We have the doctrinal things, like whether it's the Old Testament people, it was the law. For us, it's Book of Romans or the Christian doctrine. We have the doxology, which is the Psalms, the worship, how we respond in worship to God. And then we have the discipleship, the commands we have to tell us how we now live as God's people in the world. So let's think about how these fit with the idea of the inspiration of the Bible. So God works in the world. He reveals his divine attributes and purpose, like Paul says in Romans. He does signs and wonders to authorise his messengers. So we saw that last time, wasn't it? 2 weeks ago. The purpose of miracles, God at work in the world powerfully, is to reveal himself and his power and his divine attributes, but also to do those things through the hand of certain people that shows this is a person who is an authorised messenger from God, so we need to listen because they're going to tell us what God is saying to us. Old Testament, it's the prophets primarily. New Testament, it's primarily the apostles. That then flows into doctrine. So God's word through the apostles and prophets is inscripturated, is written down for the benefit of the whole community and for future generations. So Isaiah was there in Jerusalem prophesying, and well, he would have only reached a limited amount of audience, so his prophecies were written down so that all of the nation could hear what Isaiah had been prophesying, and then the future generations who needed to hear what Isaiah prophesied when they were away in exile, they had it then written down so they could remember what God said 300 years earlier. Doxology, God's people respond to his word by worshipping God in a way that brings glory to him. And that's an important thing. We're not just reading the Bible to get information or facts, are we? It's through reading the Bible, his word, that we actually come into that relationship with him, and it's a personal thing. It's God speaking in a living way to us, and so our response is a relational response. We worship him in a way that brings glory to him. And then that written word then becomes the measure, the canon, so to speak, for the life and the faith of God's people. There's a statement the Bible made the church. If you speak to a Roman Catholic, they'll actually reverse that. They'll say, no, the church made the Bible. It was the church who wrote the Bible down and who produced it and provided it. But in actual fact, it was this whole process of God at work, revealing himself, bringing people into relationship with him, that actually then produced who we are today, his people, the church. I'm just going to finish with a video from John Piper, in which he says much better than I can the ultimate reason why we can say and know and believe that it's inspired by God.
Yes, we can trust the 66 books of the Bible. We can stake our lives on these books. And the way we come to this conviction, most essentially, is by meeting Jesus Christ in the pages of this book. He stands forth from the pages in the story that has been written in a way that is self-authenticating and compelling. You meet him, he befriends you, he reduces you to a humble brokenness, he reveals himself sufficient for you in his cross, he becomes beautiful and glorious in his living and dying and rising, such that you cannot not see the magnificence of the glory and the beauty of Jesus Christ. So there's a spiritual thing that happens here. There's an objective reality that happens there. And when that objective reality and this spiritual transformation meet, light happens, and you know that this is true. Now, there are a lot of other objective historical bases and grounds, but when it comes down to an individual coming to deep conviction by which he can die, it happens at that level of seeing in and through the words in the story to the person of Jesus Christ himself, who then vindicates his word in its entirety.
So we could have saved a lot of time and just watched that video. That's the crux of it, though, isn't it? It's because in the Bible, all of the Old Testament is pointing us forward to Jesus, and then the New Testament is opening up Jesus. And he said, for which you're willing to die. That's important, isn't it? Josephus recognised that the Jews were willing to die for their scriptures. Well, they weren't really dying for their scriptures, were they? They were dying because the scriptures had given them the hope and the promises of God that they were looking forward to in the coming of the Messiah, and they were willing to die because they knew that God was faithful and would keep his promises. And in the same way, the apostles, they didn't die for the letters of the New Testament. They died because they knew the gospel, and that's why they wrote the letters, because they were willing to lay down their lives for the truth of Jesus. Okay, any other questions or comments or points for discussion on all of that? Levels of inspiration.
Right,
Yeah.
Numbers versus, I don't know, Romans or something like that.
Yeah, okay. Numbers, so the book of Numbers versus the book of Romans. Why don't we read the book of Numbers as much as the book of Romans? Why don't we seek to apply everything that's in the book of Numbers in the way that we do the book of Romans? Is it because there are different levels of inspiration? Yeah, I wouldn't say that but it's the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So we can say that the book of Numbers and the Mosaic Law are just as much God-breathed and inspired as the New Testament. But obviously they were applicable for Old Testament Israel as they looked forward to Jesus. And so there are parts in those books that are no longer apply to Christians in terms of us saying, here is a command that I must obey. I need to not eat shellfish.
And it's a whole lot of history. Like even if you were focusing on the Old Testament for a whole year of sermons, you probably wouldn't go into Numbers too much.
No, that's right. And in fact, when we were working our way through the Pentateuch as a church, we actually went quite quickly through Numbers. Yeah. But it's still inspired, because even though we say, well, I don't need to worry about eating clean or unclean foods anymore, I can still look at that and say, but this still shows me how God was preparing his people and the world for the coming of Jesus. By giving these laws about clean and unclean food, he was saying very clearly, this creation is not the way it should be. There are foods that are forbidden. There are animals, things you're not allowed to touch, otherwise you become unclean. So there's a problem in this world that needs to be fixed. How is it going to be fixed? Are you going to be living for the rest of eternity with this clean, unclean division, or is God going to do something that will no longer mean that things are unclean for you? And that was accomplished in Jesus. So in that sense, it's just as inspired, but the message that it gives to us as Christians today is looking at from a different perspective to the message it gave to Israelites in 1400 BC.
That's more Leviticus and less Numbers. Numbers seems to be more about like the specifics of who was descended from whom and how many there were and where they lived exactly. That's true. There's huge amounts of detail.
Yeah, the lists of names.
Point to anything in particular.
No, but to a Jew reading that in Old Testament times, and even in New Testament times, those lists of names and genealogies in the Old Testament were very important, because it showed that God had promised to Abraham that he would make out of Abraham a great nation, and that it would be through Abraham's offspring that he would bring blessing to all the nations. So it was very important for a Jew to be sure that I am a child of Abraham according to the flesh. So I need to know which tribe I belong to, which clan, and to be sure that, yes, I can trace that all the way back to the 12 sons of Jacob and ultimately back to Abraham. So again, it was, the inspiration is there, but it says a different message to us today, doesn't it? Because we no longer depend on that fleshly lineage back to Abraham, but we can see again, well, here's God at work in Israel, preparing everything, putting everything in place, being faithful to his promises, to the point where Jesus is born, and Matthew says, Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And you can trace Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Abraham, because of books like Numbers and the Jews being diligent about tracing their ancestry.